to change the voice around. It used to say this meeting is being recorded. Now it's in progress. So yeah, I just want to say welcome to everybody. My name is Jose Cortez, the instructor for this class. Hopefully I'll get the chance to meet a bunch of you over the course of the semester during office hours, things like that. And then today is going to be like one of the first mini lessons that we'll have over the course of the semester. And we'll have these sometimes weekly, sometimes every other week. It kind of really depends on where we are
Oh,
in the
look at your
semester and
email. I already told you.
what we're working on. Let me mute that here. Boom. Or mute. So at any rate, yeah, like I'll be having these kind of regularly, every once in a while, sometimes weekly, sometimes every other week or so. And then the whole kind of point of the mini lesson is they're never required. They're never anything that you have to attend. But I really encourage you to attend them because it's going to be most of them like really interactive, being able to, work through steps of the reading and writing process. I know our class is an asynchronous class, which means, we don't have regular times that we're meeting over the course of the semester. All the work that you're going to do. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about the structure of the class, just because this one's a little bit shorter than most of them. Mostly everything that you're going to be doing is kind of be at your own pace, like on a week to week level. But this will just kind of give an opportunity when we have these mini lessons, and they'll focus again on different things with like reading strategies. Like next week, I'll have one focusing on like starting the writing process, going over our first essay prompt, things like writing introductions, conclusions, how to integrate quotes, all sorts of different things over the course of the semester, just to make you feel like, you have some opportunity for some sort of live class. If you ever are unable to attend, no problem. I record them. And then as soon as they're done, I throw them onto YouTube, and then I'll upload them onto Canvas under our announcement page. So again, just a little bit about me. I have a little bit of a welcome. So I won't go into too much over detail than what you already saw last week. But yeah, my name is Jose. I've been at Solano for, this is my 7th year now. And then before that, I worked at Solano as a reading and writing lab tutor. And then before that, I was a student at Solano. So Solano is super important to me. I love working here. I'm also teaching some face-to-face classes, which is really awesome. So I get to teach 2 of those this semester. Hopefully as the semesters keep progressing along, I imagine there'll be more of them available in spring. And then, I'll have the opportunity to maybe see some of you in classes like English 2 or English 4. And I'll let Chris introduce himself also.
Hi, I'm Chris. I'm your TA. And I also was a student at Solano. I've been working here for, oh man, like 3, maybe 4 years now as a TA. But my end goal is to hopefully get a teaching position, either at Solano or wherever I can find one eventually. But yeah, I grew up in Fairfield. I was a student here at Solano. Like, I love this community. I love the people here. I love this school. And I look forward to working with all of y'all. So feel free to reach out whenever you have anything going on, any kind of questions.
So I just want to talk a little bit about the Struct class, and then kind of anytime as we're going through, like, please, if you have any questions, just let us know. Go ahead and ask them. You can ask them in the chat. We'll try to keep an eye on that too, or just ask them, unmute your mic and go ahead and ask. I just want to make sure that like these are more than anything else for you, like specifically, like if you have questions on the things that we're working through. So I just want to spend a few minutes going through like the structure of the class. I know I went through that a little bit last week, but I think now that you can actually see some of the assignments this week, I'm just going to share my screen and give you an idea of what those modules look like each week. And then again, if you have any questions on the structure, we can look at that. So let me just share my screen really quick with you, and then we'll take a look at that together. All right, so this is just kind of a quick little easy, breakdown of what we will typically do each week. So you should all have, by this point, I imagine, seen week 2's module is live. So each week I'll be updating a new module, right? I'll post the module live. And then in each module, there'll be kind of a overview at the very beginning, right? That'll just like let you know, here's what we're going to be working on this week. here's, some different assignments that we may have, something like that, right? Just kind of a quick breakdown of the week. These are typically going to go live on Sunday evening. Sometimes it'll be a little bit earlier and on Sunday, sometimes, I don't know, later in the evening, but before Monday, the new module will be live, right? Each week, you'll have whatever assignments that you're working on for that week will be posted through the module, and they're typically due at the end of the week. Some assignments that we're going to be doing will take a little bit longer than others. Like, for example, if we're working on a writing assignment, that might be something that's, will be 2 or 3 weeks of modules long, but I'll open up a new part of it for each week. I like next week, for example, I'll give you the first writing prompt, and then there'll be, we'll work through it that week and then moving into the following one. So the first part of any module will just be a quick little overview. And then this week, the first thing that you're going to see when we go on from there are active reading strategies. This is similar to what I'm going to go over today. It's just here I'll be live to go over it in some more detail. So if you're here now, you don't even have to worry about watching this video because this is exactly what I'll be going over. The next part of it is the first reading. So this week we have 2 different texts that we're going to be reading. The first one is written by Sherman Alexie. It's called Superman and Me. And it's going to be about his experience of learning how to read growing up on an Indian reservation in Spokane, Washington. So this will be the first piece. And then after I go over the reading strategies, I'll kind of come back into this to talk about what you're going to be doing with this reading. So you'll just be able to click the PDF, load it right there, and then have it on your computer. I recommend printing them if you can, because one of the things that we'll talk about today is just making annotations, like being able to write on the text, like make copies of things on the text, like your own reactions to things that you're reading. But if not, I mean, you can definitely do that on a computer, a tablet, or whatever else instead. The next piece of each weekly module, like this one, will be first going into having a discussion about the reading, where you're going to be sharing something that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes called Golden Lines, which is big ideas from the reading that stand out to you, right? So the way our discussions work is typically I'll ask you to post an original post. Like you can see, your first post is going to be due by August 26th. And then respond to at least one other person's post, and that'll be due by Sunday the 29th, right? So in order to get full credit for the post, all you have to do is just have your original post and then have the follow-up post, and that's it, right? And then, so for this first one, what you're going to be doing is I'm going to talk a little bit about these golden line strategies, but the idea is you're just going to find a section in the reading that really stands out to you from Alexie's Superman and Me, like what stood out to you and why? Why was this passage significant? What kind of takeaway did you have? And then I just want you kind of interacting with each other. Like the way that we read, the reactions that we have to something can be very, very different to the way that somebody else reacts to the same passage, right? And so that's why I'm curious about, like, what are reactions? What do you think to believe to be true about this passage that you read? And we'll talk about that in some reading strategies. And then I have this overview, kind of a breakdown of what allusions are, references to things in text. So you'll read through this section, and then there's another reading that you'll look at. This is the beginning of a book called Saigon by a writer named Phuc Tran. That's about his experience as a refugee moving into Pennsylvania, Vietnam. So kind of what his experience was like as being somebody who's in a completely different environment, not culturally accepted, and then what his experience was like through school. So there's a lot of similarities between what Alexie's talking about and what Tran is talking about through here. And then after you're done reading through this, there's another assignment that's focused on allusions and how understanding, for instance, in text help you get to a deeper understanding of what a text is focusing on. So that's kind of a quick little breakdown of what each week will look like, right? When you're looking at a module, just kind of going through that. This is meant to take you about a week to make it through, right? Week 2's worth of work. But when you're finished with this, you can get it done earlier, you can get it done by Sunday. Then what will happen again is Sunday, I'll open up week 3 and you'll be able to move into the next week of assignments. Does anyone have any questions at all about the module and how they work, or anything that we're doing as far as like the structure of the class? I know
I have
for
a
many.
question.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if we do the initial post, does it have to be the same day to respond to the student? I mean, to another class. I mean, classmate.
No, it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't have to be the same date is because typically that's why I have like 2 different due dates for them. Because like, let's say, for example, you do your post today. If you're the first one, there's not really going to be anyone else for you to respond to. So I typically would say like, do your original post by one day, and then you'll have a few days to be able to respond to somebody else's post. Because like, if you're the first to make a post, or if maybe there's only like 1 or 2 other people's posts and like, you don't really feel like you have any kind of like point to add to that, you can wait a little while and then until you add on to that point.
Okay, thank you.
I got a
Any other
question.
questions? Yeah, absolutely. One.
So when you said we have to pick like a golden line from the passage, do we have to rewrite it or do we just start explaining it with our 50 words?
You could just rewrite it like small if you want to. Like it could just be like a really small quote. Like you could be like, you know, what Alexi says, and you could just do like the beginning of it. It's like the little, like the 3 dots, the ellipsis for here's the section where it came from. It doesn't have to be, you know, if it's like a whole, it shouldn't be like a whole paragraph. We'll talk about this in a second, but it could be just like a sentence or an idea that he said, but you don't have to write like the whole entire thing out if you don't want to. Just enough so people know what it is.
And would that count as the 50 words?
No, the 50 words will be like your reaction to what's happening there.
Okay,
Because that's what I'm really curious about. Yeah, it's like, what are your thoughts about what you're reading?
Thanks.
Any other questions at all about any class structure type things? All right, so let's take a look at some reading strategies, because that's what really we're going to focus on for this week. Let me just share this really quick. Hang on. Okay. Oh, hang on. I clicked the wrong thing. You can all see this active reading thing on here, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyone?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
All right. So for this class, like, I think that the reason that printing the copy of the readings is really helpful is for making annotations when you're reading, right? Like sometimes, you know, if we're reading things on our computer screen, right? Like depending on what kind of program we're using or something like that, for the most part, it's going to be pretty difficult to be able to write down your reactions to something you're reading, right? Like, and so I think that it's really important to be able to find some kind of way, whether it's like downloading the PDF onto a reader where you can, I don't know, like type into it and make reactions, whether it's things like highlighting, things like that, can be helpful. But for the big thing is you want to make sure that there's some way that you can write on what you're reading, right? To be able to have some kind of way of like making reactions, making notes, and we'll talk about some of the different things that you'll do as you're reading through the passage. So for this class, I really want us to think about like the reading strategy is an active one, right? Like where you're engaged. Like I think a definition of reading that I really like is that there's a discourse, right? There's a back and forth conversation between the reader and the writer. So in the same way that if we're having a conversation with each other, right? Like there's follow-up questions we have, there's reactions that we have to the things that people are saying, right? It's not like you're talking to somebody and they're kind of just sitting there listening without nodding their head, without shaking their head no, without saying anything back to what you're saying to them, right? And the same thing is true of reading. We can be reading things that somebody is saying, right? I mean, and we've had this reaction, maybe we've like read a post on somebody's Facebook page or read an article before and kind of had a reaction to it, like, oh man, like either laugh at something that somebody says or be angry at something that somebody says or be excited by something that somebody says. Whatever the case is like we're constantly reacting to the things that we're reading. And so as we're doing that, like that's kind of our back and forth conversation that we're having with the writer. And so one of the ways that we can keep track of that and kind of keep track of our ideas is by writing notes to the things that we're reading, right? And I think that's a really helpful strategy because again, like the way I react to a text or the feelings that I have about something that I'm reading can be incredibly different than the person that's sitting next to me or the person that's next to us in the Zoom room, right? Is this idea is that like every one of our life experiences, every one of our things that we bring to the table when we're reading something, while we can have similarities to each other, we can also have tremendous differences, right? The things that we believe to be true about the world, the experiences that we've lived through can really impact the way that we feel about the idea that somebody is presenting. And so, for example, as you're going through a reading, I think it's really important for this class to not think about this idea of like there's a right and a wrong answer to the things that we're reading, right? It's just what your reaction is to them. There is no right and wrong. There's no, was this writer right with this idea or were they incorrect with this idea? It's like, well, what do you think? Do you agree with this point? Do you disagree with this point? Kind of a why or why not. So we're moving past this idea of like, this is right and this is wrong to here's what I believe about this person's ideas and why.
Yeah, this for me personally, this is like one of the breakthrough strategies for me of like learning how to read text that I didn't like. Is I think we've all had experiences of coming across something in a class that we just like could not get into, or there was just something about the reading that we hated. It's like if you're able to like write down those thoughts, and even if those thoughts are like, I disagree with this, I hate this character, and just tearing that book apart, you're still actively reading and doing that work. And that's a great way to stay engaged in it.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like there doesn't have to be this idea. And I think this is really important to think about for the readings for this class is, you know, I think that like we get like indoctrinated or we get like taught these ideas in school that like this is the structure of school. And one of the things that I felt is like whenever a teacher would give us something to read, that I felt like I had to like it, right? Or that I had to agree with the ideas that the reading was presenting. When in reality, like just because somebody, you know, you're reading something for a class, like you can still do a great job with the reading and disagree with most of the ideas that the writer has to say, right? Like I remember I had that relation when I was a student at Solano, actually. There was a book that I read that like the teacher absolutely loved. It's, I don't, some of you may have read it because a lot of teachers still teach it, and it's called Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. But basically the writer's argument is that because television's job is to entertain us, we can't learn anything from watching TV. And I was like, that's a bullshit argument. I don't agree with that one bit, right? I learn a ton from watching TV. Some TV shows that I watch, I don't learn that much from, right? Like there's shows that are my guilty pleasure TV shows, right? Like 90 Day Fiance. I don't really learn a lot from watching that show, but I like it because it's entertaining, right? But when I watch things like Planet Earth or something on like National Geographic or something like that, I learn a ton from watching those. There's places that I feel like I have experience of culture, places that I'll never travel in my life, right? Or I hope to one day, but I might not have that opportunity. I learn about different people's cultures. I learn about, you know, different things in nature for places that I'll never have that opportunity to see. So like as soon as I read that beginning of this guy's book, I was like, I disagree with this person's premise. So I'm ready with different ideas that he's presenting throughout his book to argue against what he has to say because I don't believe it to be true. So I think it's really important to think that like you don't have to just be like, oh, I like this, I agree with this, or your golden lines don't have to be that either. They don't have to be like, here's a passage that I found that I really like and here's why. It could be like, here's a passage that I found that I disagree with and here's why I disagree with that writer's idea. So please don't ever feel like you have to agree with what a writer is saying or what I believe, because again, my perspective on a reading or Chris's perspective on a reading or the person next to in class's perspective on a reading is exactly that. It's their perspective on a reading. It doesn't have to be yours. We can find areas where we maybe agree and challenge, but we can also find areas where we challenge each other's ideas. And I think that's a really, really important thing in this class. So when you're picking up something to read, one of the things that you want to do is maybe for the first time is think about this idea of like previewing a text, right? In the same way that you would if you watch a movie trailer, right? Did you have this idea of like, what are you getting into to read before you start reading it? So like, for example, if you're getting ready to read an article for the first time, sometimes the preview can be something really small, right? Like, for example, reading Sherman Alexie's Superman and Me. You might just want to Google who is Sherman Alexie, right? Or it might be like, you know, if you learn something about that person, like where are they from? We learned that he's from the Spokane Indian Reservation. Like, where is that? What is an Indian reservation, right? So it's like doing little things like that is a really helpful way to start to feel like I understand this before I move in to start reading it, right? I think about it the same way as like before I start watching a TV show or before I watch a movie, I like to watch the trailer and get some kind of idea of what I'm about to get into before I move into it. And so this could be a really, really helpful strategy to be able to help boost your comprehension before you even read something, because you have a context for it. So there's different things that you can do, right? Like you could read the title. That's super obvious, right? But I think it's really important because sometimes in the title, there might be a word that you're like, oh, I don't know this word, or why did they put this word in this title, right? And it can just really kind of make you think about it, or it might be a place where you want to Google something, right? We talked about this idea of Googling the writer. A lot of times if somebody's writing about their life experiences, then, you know, you're imagining that the things that you learn about who they are, what they've lived through, is going to be the case for what their writing is going to focus on. And this is really true of the first two readings, right? Like that these people are writing about, these are from basically kind of memoirs of theirs, of like, here's what their life experiences that they're going to be sharing. So sometimes there's the editor's introduction. So like, for example, if we, somewhere back behind me is Trevor Noah's book, there it is. Like one of the things that you might do, like as you pick up his book, right, what we're going to be reading for our class, we're not starting it this week, but as you know, in the next few weeks when we start reading this book, you might want to just like grab it, thumb through the little beginning of the book, right, kind of look in this section. I often, just like I'm looking at a movie, I read the back of the book to kind of get some idea. An editor's introduction will help tell you a little bit, but like just to kind of get some context, right? So just this idea of like, I pick it up, I kind of start thumbing through it a little bit, and I could do the same thing with an article before I start reading, because now before I start reading the piece, I already have an idea of what it's going to be about. And so that's going to help with comprehension quite a bit. So what are people's like feelings about reading? Like who has some reactions to reading? Whether you like to read, whether you dislike to read, why and why not? There's no wrong answer to this, but how do people in this class feel about reading?
Hello.
Yeah, hi.
Hello.
Reading's kind of whatever.
Yeah,
Like
it's
I
kind of
do
whatever.
it sometimes, yeah, but like not really.
Okay, so what'll make it the difference between if you want to do it or not want to do it?
Well, I usually like reading comic books a lot, so
Uh-huh.
like I guess with pictures, I guess, but like,
Mhm.
if I have to read something without pictures, I'll do it anyway. So it's like in the middle.
Okay, but you're not as enthusiastic about it, right?
Yeah, unless like it's like a really good story, but like
Yeah.
that's why I read the back of the book first.
Good, right? So unless it's a good story, right? And I'm sure that's probably a pretty common feeling that people have about reading, right? That if it's, unless it's a good story, it's maybe something that's not that, it's not that, I don't know, interesting to you, or maybe something you don't want to do as much. Good. What are the feelings people have about reading?
I personally enjoy reading.
You do? Good.
Um,
Okay, how come?
well, first of all, I'm a criminal justice major, and so reading is very important for my career. However, I just feel like reading is very important because most of our lives is based on text, you know, from instructions on how to cook things, directions on how to cook things, even reading the map on your GPS. Everything pretty much that we do consists of us reading. So like the previous guy said, it does depend on the actual book that I read if it's an interest of mine. But I don't mind reading, because most of the times if we don't read something, we always have to go back and fix something. We have to redo
Right.
it. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, right? Like that, like we're constantly reading, right? And so even in a situation where people would say, and sometimes I'll hear people say that with like, oh, I don't read. And I'm like, well, that's never going to be true, right? Like, I mean, because there is that, like, am I sitting on my couch instead of watching TV and reading a book? Yeah, maybe that's not as common of occurrence for me, right? Especially since, you know, I'm reading for classes a lot and stuff like that. But you're right. I mean, we're constantly reading everything from like GPS in our car to directions on how to do something. I read recipes all the time, right? I read online about different interests that I have, different hobbies that I have, right? Like whatever it is that I'm into, like I am constantly reading about it. But I think that that's one of those things to Sebastian's point of this idea of like how I feel about reading changes significantly depending on what I'm reading, right? If it's something that I'm reading that I'm really enjoying, then I really like to read. If it's something that I'm reading that I don't really enjoy, a subject that I'm not as interested in, then my interest in reading changes significantly, right? And so I think that like it's really hard to look at like this as like this I have a one way or another attitude about it, right? It's kind of like if I were to say like, do I like watching videos on YouTube? Yeah, absolutely. If it's something that I'm interested in, right? But if it's the videos that like my 7-year-old watches on YouTube, those drive me crazy to the point where it's like I have to constantly like tell him to turn it down, turn it down. Like I can't listen to the YouTubers that he follows. In the same way that if he were to watch, you know, a bunch of guys barbecuing or people talking about bicycles, like he would be over listening to my YouTube channels also, right? And so I think that the idea is like our interests and what we care about the topic really, really impacts what our attitude is about something. And so when we're thinking about reading for this class, there are going to be times, and I hope that over the course of the semester, the things that I pick, people are like, hey, this is interesting, or I enjoy this topic, or I'm, you know, at least there's some ideas that I can argue with or identify with, or whatever the case is. But one of the things that can really help is as you're reading through things, especially if you hit those moments where you can feel like this reading is a little bit either difficult or maybe I'm not as engaged with it. If you're reading a textbook for a class or something like that, like active reading and like reading with something to write in your hand can be really, really helpful. So as you're reading through, like I really recommend using, like if you're not typing on a text, like a pencil instead of just a highlighter. Like one of the things when you're reading with just a highlighter is like I can highlight a section of text and I can be like a week later, I don't remember why I highlighted it, right? But if you're reading through, think about, you know, writing on the thing that you're reading to be able to help it, because your notes and your ideas to what you're reading are really important, right? So here's some different things that you want to think about. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, no, I've definitely had scenarios in classes, especially if you're reading something for a class and you know it's something that like you're gonna have to reference later for an essay, like we're going to do later in this class, where you're going to have to like bring quotes, and we'll get to that eventually. But or if you're like doing a test or something and you're just like highlighting like crazy in your book, you're going to end up going back to that book and just seeing the entire thing highlighted and not knowing the importance of anything, or like what the information was that you were trying to get out of this. I've definitely done that before. So yeah, it's really nice to write things down so you actually have an idea when you go back and be like, oh, this is the idea I'm looking at here.
Absolutely, right? Like that you want to make sure that you're making notes, and all the notes have to do is make sense to you, right?
Yeah.
Like your reactions, as long as your reactions, the text makes sense to you. And sometimes we develop like shorthand for taking notes in classes or things like that. Like as long as it makes sense to you and you can go back and look at it, and that's all that matters, right? So things that you want to be looking for is you want to be looking for defining maybe new or unfamiliar vocabulary words, right? Like this is a really helpful thing to look for. Like one of the things is that, you know, I get asked a lot is like, how do I increase my vocabulary, right? Like, how do I learn new words? How do I, you know, add new words into my vocabulary when I'm speaking or when I'm writing? And one of the most helpful ways of doing it is just by reading, right? But when you're reading, if you run across a new word, or I use like unfamiliar, I use the word like fuzzy vocabulary. And those are kind of those words where like, I know the word, but I've never heard it used that way before, or I kind of know the word, but I'm a little bit fuzzy on the definition of the word, right? Like defining those can be really, really helpful, especially putting the definition for those words in your own words can be a helpful way for you to incorporate those words into your vocabulary. So a lot of times I'll be reading something and I'll be like, I don't know what that word means. And it's just a quick little, you know, grab my phone and Google it and look it up. We'll talk this semester about some strategies to be able to figure out meanings of words by using the context or using words around them to help you figure out what a word means, to kind of just help you guess the meaning of the word. But I think that like looking up words that are like either fuzzy to you or completely new is really helpful. If a writer uses a word either in the title of something, in the beginning of a paragraph, or uses a word again and again in a paragraph, it's probably going to be really important, right? And so those are going to be one of those words where for sure you would want to make sure that you look that up, because it's going to be a key idea, right? It's going to be what we call key terms in vocabulary. So some sort of big idea this writer wants you to understand. And so I think that that's a really, really helpful strategy just for you, like to be able to pull in new vocabulary. I'll do that all the time. Like, you know, I'll be in a meeting or something like that, and people will use a word, or I'm like, I don't know what that is. Or, you know, we'll be talking about some sort of, you know, law that's getting passed in the state about education, and someone will really quickly make a reference to like, you know, assembly bills in education or in the state are called AB. And someone will be like, oh, in AB 705. And I'm like, the first time I heard that, I was like, what's AB 705? And I'll just write down on my notes for my meeting, look up AB 705. And then when I go back to my office, then I'll go and I'll Google it and I'll make sure that I have an understanding of it, right? So even in conversation with people or in meetings that I'm sitting in, I'm constantly looking for new vocabulary or terms that are unfamiliar to me.
I would
The
say
other thing-
especially,
yeah, go ahead, Chris.
sorry. I would say definitely when you're doing research later on for this class and you're dealing with like academic papers and stuff, you're going to come across a lot of times where you'll see a word that maybe you've even heard of and are kind of familiar with, but they're using it in a way that's just like totally foreign to you.
Mhm.
Like, I think that happens a lot to me with like the idea of postmodernism. I've come across a lot. Like I'll deal with like 5 different writers referencing postmodernism in like totally different ways. And you'll definitely come across scenarios like that. So being able to like sift through that vocabulary and kind of figuring out exactly what they'll mean, and especially when there's like words like that in academic papers, like you usually find that they kind of defined it themselves in their papers.
Mhm.
So being able to like find those places and keeping track of what their meaning is like is super, super helpful.
And I think that's really helpful for this week's second assignment, the allusions. An allusion
Mhm.
is a reference to something, right? Like when you're referring to something and giving that maybe you assume that the reader knows what you're talking about, right? And so if you think about like references, like there's times where I'm sure we do this with our friends, like where we might reference a TV show, or you could reference a movie, or you could reference a musician, and you would assume that everybody knows what you're talking about, right? And so sometimes writers will do that. They'll assume that their audience understands the reference that they're making, right? I do that with my friends where like I'll make a reference to a TV show that we watch or some sort of joke that's on the show, and I assume that they know that that's where that's coming from. You're not going to find those allusions in the dictionary, right? Instead, Google is going to be really helpful for those. But there could be times where it's not even just a vocabulary word, but maybe if somebody were to say, like, for example, in Phuc Tran's writing, he talks about having a haircut. And one of the haircuts that he talks about is he references like specific hair, and he references like a band called the Smiths. And if he were to talk about them, if you've never seen the lead singer of the Smiths named Morrissey or what his hair looks like, it's really easy to miss that reference, right? But that's just a Google search away, right? And so I think it's one of those things that when a writer is doing that and they're referencing something, they could be referencing a musician, they could referencing something. Usually these are like pop culture, they're cultural, right? There's something that if I were to say, oh, I don't know, if I were to be wearing like a big sweater and I say, I feel like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man. If you've never seen the Ghostbusters movie, right, which might be a little bit of an old reference, but like when I was little, if we ever wearing a big sweater, you'd be like, feel like you have like, you look like a giant marshmallow, right? Like if I were to make that reference, my kids have no idea what that reference is. Similarly, my kids who are 7 and 10 make references that I have no idea what they are, because unless I'm playing with my son, like I don't know, I don't play Fortnite, I don't listen to a lot of the same music that they do, things like that. And so like there's a lot of references that they make that I don't get.
Or
I have a new, oh yeah, go ahead.
I would also say like maybe you see that reference differently. Maybe you saw the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man as a little kid and it scared the crap out of you.
Right.
So the Stay Puft
Exactly.
Marshmallow Man is something frightening when you read that in the text, and you need to figure out like what exactly does it mean to the writer when they're bringing up this thing.
Right. And then if you think about that too, like think about the references that maybe like I have a niece and a nephew, and they're both 18 and in college, and it's like the references they make, the things that they listen to, the music they listen to, the TV show watch are very, very, very different. Even though I don't think of myself as being that old, it makes me feel like a super old man, right? Like we had a graduation party for my niece over the summer at my house. And it was like, I was like, you know, chatting with her friends a little bit, like as I was barbecuing and talking with the kids and stuff. And I was like, like, yeah, I feel super old, right? Like I just like the references, the things they were talking about just like felt incredibly different. Even to the point where like sometimes like my nephew will be talking and he'll use some slang or he'll use something and I'm like, I don't know what that is, right? And I have to ask and follow up, and then it makes me feel like an old man. So really kind of think about this idea of like what references are and how they're used, because like Googling can really help you figure that out, right? The other thing that you want to think about is this idea of talking to the text. Like this sounds silly, right? This idea, like what you're saying, but think about it in the same way that you would if you're watching a movie with somebody who's pretty annoying and constantly talking during the movie or the TV show. And that person is me, right? Like if I'm watching a movie or a TV show at home with like my family or friends or something like that, I'm kind of one of those people that's like, oh, if that was me, I would blah, 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 blah. I don't do it when I go to the movie theater, right? Because I'm, aware of people around me who have spent money to go see a movie. But I definitely do it when I'm sitting down and couch and annoying my wife when we're watching a TV show. But I'm constantly talking to the movie, right? Or talking to the text. And I do the same thing if I'm listening to, I don't know, somebody talk. If I'm watching, political debates or I'm reading an article, I'd be like, I don't know if I agree with that, or that's a really great point, right? This is a really helpful strategy for you to put down what your reactions to the text are. So if you're reading something and a writer makes a point, you're like, I think that's a really good point because here's what I believe to be true about this. Or I don't agree with this idea because here's why I disagree with it. So even just agree can be really helpful. But maybe there's similar situations where a writer is talking about a situation where, for example, in Trevor Noah's book, there's a lot of places where the way that he talks about the way his mom raised him reminds me a lot of my experiences with my family, right? And one of the things that he talks about in his book is he talks about his mom used to drive him around to show him like really nice neighborhoods, right, in South Africa, where there was a huge disparity, right, or still can be a huge disparity between poverty and wealth. And so he talks about this experience about his mom driving him around and showing him all these different mansions. And when I read that, it made me think about like when I was a kid, I remember my mom would like always love to go look at like when they opened up new houses and you'd be able to walk through like the model of the house. And I remember like when they opened up Paradise Valley in Fairfield or they opened up Rancho Solano in Fairfield, like we would go and we walk through these houses. And I remember just like when I read that, I was like, I had the same reaction that Trevor Noah did, is this idea of like, one day it would be amazing to live in a house with stairs, or what if I could live in one of these neighborhoods, right? And it was just this moment of like something really similar. When I read this book the first time, I was like, I wrote down, this is exactly like walking through model homes with my mom when I was a kid, right? And so it could just be something really small, but what you never know is that later on, I can use that idea to help me write an essay, because that was more than just walking through houses with my mom as a kid. That was her letting me see the possibility of things that she would hope that I'd be able to accomplish one day, that she worked hard for, to be able to try to be able to send my brother and I to college so that we'd be able to have those opportunities, right? Very similar to what Trevor Noah's mom did. So I could use that, and that might be a building block later on. Something as simple as just a small little reaction I made on a text to a personal experience could help me build an essay later on, right? And so really kind of think about that as you're writing, that it could be something really small, but it could be tremendously significant later on for your writing assignments. Also, write down any questions you have when you're reading, right? These questions can be helpful to bring up when we're meeting in an office hour. If you're ever reading something, you want to send me an email, or maybe you want to post in our discussion board, right? Like it could be like, the writer brought up this idea here. I'm not quite sure what they meant by this. Like we could talk about that in an office hour and go over a reading together. You could post it in a discussion post. You could send me an email, talk to Chris about it, right? And so like having questions as you're reading, if you have a question on a text on like page 1, you might even forget the question by the time, if you're like me, by the time you get to page 5, right? If you read something on Monday, by Friday, if you, I don't know, have an appointment to meet with me during my office hours, stuff like that, I could be like, hey, do you have any questions on the reading? You're like, I did, but I don't remember what it was, right? Like our memories sometimes aren't that good. And so just writing things down can be a helpful way to keep track of your questions. And the last thing that I want to think about, like kind of these reading strategies, is the idea of golden lines, right? And these ideas of golden lines are parts of the passage or the reading that really stand out to you, that you fully feel like you understand, right? That like, no matter what, here's an idea that you understand. And so as you're going through and you're reading, really look for these places that are significant for you, where this passage really stood out to me. I feel like I really understood this, and here's what I feel about this thing that I read, right? And so like, for example, the example I shared with Trevor Noah's reading, that passage really stood out to me, and I understood it because I lived that experience. And so that would be a golden line for me, something that I could say from his book, that like, here is a section where no matter what, I get this idea, I like this idea, and I want to make sure that I write this down because it's just tremendously strong, right? And so that's what we're really looking for, is we're looking for these places where something that a writer says, something that a writer stands out. Like, I have another golden line of Trevor Noah's when we read his book, it's awesome, but he says, like, one of the places, like by far my favorite line in his entire book, he says, we tell people to follow their dreams, but you can only dream what you can imagine. And depending on where you come from, your imagination can be quite limited. Like, that's a golden line. I feel like I understand that idea, but I also love that idea, right? That like, what one person can dream is incredibly different than what somebody else can dream, because their environment might be limiting their dreams, right? Like, you could agree with that, you could disagree with that. That's totally up to you. But for me, that's a golden line of Trevor Noah's, because like, that line I think is profound. I think that it makes me think about my life. It makes me, then I can write about why, right? But like, that's an example. It's small. It doesn't have to be super long. It doesn't have to be a bunch of different sentences, right? But the idea is there's something that a writer says where you're like, whoa, I want to grab a hold of that. I like that idea, right? And even in my book, like the first time that I read this, I made like a little note over on the corner about why I liked it, right? So I think that's really important. It's like, this should be a moment that stands out to you. Just like if you're listening to a song, you're like, oh, I love this part of this song, or I love the beat of this song, or I love the line that this person is singing that says in this song. It's just this moment that you can grab a hold of, right? Any questions at all on these reading strategies?
I would say one more thing about golden lines is like, don't worry if you come into class, and especially for reading something complex, like, and you come into class and you understood maybe like 20-30% of the reading, and that's it. That's the only piece you got from it. That's okay. That's what's great about these golden lines. It's like, you still have something that you can say like, okay, I didn't understand most of this, but I got this line. This is the thing I kind of understood and can kind of bring that to class, and with your understanding, like, we can kind of work through the reading, and we can like really unpack the rest of the text using that golden line. Like, that's pretty much what I've done in classes. I didn't call it golden lines, but like, I've definitely come to classes like barely understanding anything, but having something to grab onto that I can use to kind of start making sense of the rest, because nobody has a complete understanding of everything that we read, because we all bring different perspectives to stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great start to bring you in and really help unpack like really complicated ideas.
Yeah, that's a really good point, right? Is it like, it's never about like, I understood this whole entire reading. And I think that's really important also to think about with like, doing your reading for this class does not mean that you understand everything that you've read.
Yeah.
Right. Like, I remember there was times where like, that was really helpful for me, and kind of one of those feelings where I was able to like take a sigh when I would go into class. Like, I took probably the hardest class that I took. I think the two hardest classes I've ever taken in college for me was English 370, which used to be a class we had at Solano that was a step below English 1. So basically English 1 was one of my hardest classes. Not that I think this class is going to try to be that, but it was just like, I was learning how to write. I was learning how to be a student. That was a tough class. And then a class I took in graduate school where we just read research all the time. And I remember going into that class, and she'd give us these really difficult research articles to read. And I remember just like sitting there reading them at home, and I was like, oh shit, I'm in way over my head. Like, I don't understand 50% of this stuff that I'm reading. And then when we went to our first class to discuss the reading, she was like, what'd you guys think of the reading? Tell me your thoughts. And I was afraid, but I was like, I felt like I only stood 20-30% of the stuff that I read. And she's like, good, now we can start talking about the reading, right? And that's kind of the way that I want you to think about this. I imagine it's not going to be that you feel that lost with the readings at all, right? Like, I try to pick stuff that's accessible, that really connects to people's life experiences. But I think it's really important to think about this idea that like, doing the reading does not mean that I understand every single idea of this reading. Like, that's the way I feel like I learned about reading when I was younger and in high school. It's like, you have to go through and be able to take a quiz on the things that you read. Do you remember the facts from this reading? That's not the way that we read for this class. And I feel like that's not what's important in reading. What's important in reading is this idea of like, are you engaging with these ideas? Are you asking questions? Are you curious about the ideas the writer's presenting? Are you being critical of the writer's ideas? Are you finding places where you're confused with the writer's ideas? Are you challenging yourself through this process? So even if you've read something and you say, hey, I want to meet during an office hour to talk about a reading, and I'm like, well, what did you think? It's like, I don't understand the beginning of it and I am completely stuck. That's doing your reading, right? And so we can talk through that and work through it together. When you're reading, like I like in the chat, Bisa said that they'd rather read a book that's 100 short chapters than read a book that's 5 long chapters, right? Like, I think that's a really good way to think about this idea of like chunking things. I want to go backwards. My computer's being goofy. There we go. Chunking things and taking breaks while you're reading. Like, this is a really important reading strategy. Don't feel that you have to sit there and do all the reading in one sitting. Sometimes you might just be like, oh, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to read a page of the reading this week. And then, you know, a few hours later, I'm going to read another page or two, right? Like, I like to think about it in the same way that I would, like, if you were to say, like, run a really long distance, can feel really, really overwhelming, right? But if I were to say, oh, but you have to be able to run this distance over, you know, a week, then it's not that hard to do anymore, right? Like, it's just this idea of like breaking things up in these little manageable pieces. One of the things I hear people say all the time about reading is like, I'll sit there and I'll read and then I'll forget something after I'm done reading it. I do that all the time too. And if I am in a situation where I'm trying to read too much or do too much at once, then I just get fatigued. I feel that way on Zoom, right? That's why I, you know, like teaching an asynchronous online class. Today's one of those days where I'm going to be in like a 3-hour long Zoom meeting later this afternoon. And by hour 2, I'm burnt out. I kind of start drifting around. I start looking out the window. I might pick up my phone, right? Because 3 hours of a Zoom meeting, and there's days where I have 7 hours of Zoom meetings. It's too much, right? And it's one of those things, like the same thing with reading. If I'm sitting there and I've got to read and read and read page after page after page for hours at a time, it's way too much for me. So I break it up in pieces when I can. I might do 20 minutes at a time. I might do 30 minutes at a time. I might be able to do an hour or two at a time. But I think what's important is that like you just break it into little pieces, and that really help with your comprehension. And it'll also help with that feeling when you're writing things down where I don't forget what I just read because I just made a little note of it. Like reading things again, same thing. Like this will be written in the passage you have, but like it's really, really important that like we're rereading things, right? Like sometimes we read something and we need to read it again, and then we need to read it again to feel that like we fully have understood it. I think about that with like movies that I've watched. Like there's movies that I've seen, I'm like, oh, that was really good. I really want to watch that again. And then I watch it again and I take something else from it. Or I've done that with TV shows. Like I've watched a show and then I've rewatched the whole series again. And I'm like, I didn't even pick up on this last time. Or I have a new favorite character, or I have a new favorite moment, or something that I didn't like before stands out now, or whatever the case is, right? I have a different experience this time going through. So I think that's a really helpful strategy, is like you might pull something different from something, or you might be able to understand a passage. It doesn't have to be reading the whole thing again. It could be reading a sentence 2 or 3 different times, right? To really know that you have a deep understanding of what that writer is saying. Also, talking through the reading with someone, this is a really, really helpful strategy. And this could just be like somebody, you know, in your house, right? Like it could be a family member, it could be a friend, it could be a partner, it could be whoever you want it to be, right? Like, but I think that like, I don't know, for example, that Trevor Noah quote, it doesn't have to be you read the whole thing to them, but you could be like, hey, this writer is saying this. Like, what do you think? Do you believe that's true? Do you agree with that writer? Do you disagree with that writer? And sometimes just talking through the things that you're reading with people can be a tremendously helpful way for you to feel like you understand it, right? So I do this all the time, right? Like I'll be reading something and like, you know, like my wife is a nurse and is doing some training right now to start doing like operation room nursing. And then sometimes I'll just ask her, like, what are you learning right now in this training meeting that you're in? And she's like, oh, we're learning about this. And I was like, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. Tell me about it. Right. And so it's like just that process of her explaining it to me is really helping her learn it and fully understand it. And I have to do the same thing. Like there's times where I'll through things with people and I'll be, well, here's this thing that I'm reading. Here's this law that's getting ready to be passed in education. And here's what I think about it. And it's like just me talking through it is really helping me comprehend it. So there's going to be times where maybe just it could be helpful if it's somebody else in the class that you know, maybe you get to know somebody else in the class. That's what I hope to do in our discussion boards. Maybe you'll come to an office hour and meet with me or meet with Chris. Maybe you're talking to somebody in your house, a friend, whatever the case is like, it's really, really helpful to feel like you fully understand the thing, to be able to talk through that thing. I mean, that's the nice part about being in a community with people, being in a class with people, is be able to talk through those things.
I'll just back that up by saying, like, never feel like you're wasting my time by just like sending me an email and being like, hey, like, what did this mean in the reading? Or just like having some ideas about the reading. Go ahead. Like, I love to have those discussions.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the last point that I want to make is that we're going to be having these mini lessons throughout the semester, but please use our office hours like as much as possible. Like my office hours are only on Monday advertised ones this semester because I'm also teaching on campus 2 days a week. So it's a little bit more limited on like, you know, which days I'm available. But it doesn't mean that Monday from 9 to 1 are the only times that I'm available. Those are just the times that I'm scheduled where for sure I will be on Zoom at those times on the same ID. But if there's ever a time where you want to meet and talk about a reading, there's plenty of other times that I'm here or that I'm available. And I can even meet like through Zoom, like on days that I'm on campus, things like that. But just let me know, like use my office hours, send me emails. You have both Chris and I have our Google Voice account set up, right? You can give us a call, you can send us a text. And if there's ever a time where you're like, hey, I want to talk through a reading, or I want to look at this essay that we're working on together, or I want you to read my essay or my whole essay or whatever the case is, right? Like, please don't ever feel like you're bothering us to meet us during office hours, right? Like this is exactly what we're here for. Like when I'm on a face-to-face campus, right? And we're walking around and stuff like that, like it's so much easier to be able to be in contact with people because I see you every single day, or not every day, but you know, at least 2 days a week. Or sometimes I'll see people on campus and I'll be walking through campus. I was like, hey, I have a question about a reading. I'm like, cool, walk with me on my way to my next class and let's talk through it, right? Like I never feel like that's somebody bothering me. Like I love that, right? I love the opportunity to get to know you over the course of the semester, to talk with you, to be able to like have some sort of interaction beyond just a name that I see on Canvas or a name that I see in a black box on Zoom, right? So if there's ever times that you have questions about a class, please don't ever hesitate to meet with us, to email and be like, if my office hours don't for you, if Chris's available hours don't work for you, let us know and one of us will find time to be able to meet with you. We've met with students in the evening. We've met with students on the weekends, right? Like there's time where we're available between one or the other of us to be able to meet with you, to answer those questions, to read through essays, to talk through readings, whatever that case is. So again, like I cannot stress it enough. Like the reality is that sometimes, you know, I know there can be those experiences where it can feel a little bit, you know, difficult to meet with an instructor for the first time, right? It can sometimes, I've had those teachers in the past where I felt like, oh, am I bothering this person? Like they were sending off like a little bit of a weird energy. But the reality is like instructors are paid for office hours, right? And the same way that I would never expect that somebody would say, hey, am I bothering you, when they come into my class that meets on Tuesday and Thursday from 9:30 to 11:30? It's like, that's when my class meets. I'm supposed to be there. Every teacher that you have at Solano is paid for their office hours. That's a time that they are supposed to be there to meet with students, to talk through that, right? And I'm not saying that that's the reason that I want to meet with you is because I'm paid to be there in my office hour. The reason that I tell students that is because you're never bothering a teacher to meet during office hours because that is their job to be there, right? Beyond my required office hours of 4 hours a week, please don't ever feel like you're bothering me, to email me at any time that you want, to send texts if you have questions about readings, because like it's so hard for us to not be here on campus to feel like we have that kind of community. So is any other way that I feel like we can reach out, that we can meet with you, that we can answer questions for you, we can do things like that, is going to be helpful for your success over the course of the semester, and just to be able to like talk through ideas and feel that we have some class community. So again, please don't ever feel like you're bothering us. Please don't ever feel like, you know, or I'm using office hours too much. Like I feel like the stronger I became as a student over the course of my experience in college, the more I utilized teachers' office hours, right? I mean, there were teachers, I'd go to their office hours at least 2 or 3 times a week because or meet with them at least 2 or 3 times a week because I had like legitimate questions, and it really, really helped me work through the class, right? And so again, talk to us, let us know, emails, if there's times that you want to meet that don't work for us, we'll find times to be able to meet with you. Any questions at all about class, anything like that in general? Anything about this week's assignments? Cool. So I'll be here. I have office hours today till 1 o'clock. So if you have any questions, I'll still be in this Zoom. If not, hopefully I get the opportunity to, you know, work with all of you and meet all of you beyond, you know, just seeing you on Canvas. But if you have any questions at all, stick around, or you can hop back in, and then yeah, we'll be here to work through any of the assignments or any questions you have over the course of the next few hours.
I don't have office hours, but sometimes you'll find me in Jose's office hours. And if not, just feel free to reach out and we can schedule to meet on something, or email me. Same thing as all he just said. Like I love meeting and talking to people. That's honestly like one of my favorite things of working here is working with people one-on-one and getting to know people. So don't ever feel like you're like wasting my time or something along those lines. Like feel free to reach out whenever you need.
Cool. Thanks for coming. And like I said, if anyone has any questions, I'll be in here. So stick around.